A Lady's Maid by Sarah Gailey. Upstairs in the bedroom. Isaac hadn't taken the news of the engagement well. Nadia reflected on this as she pressed her cheek against the cool wall of her washtub. She was strong, and Isaac Cornett was a small man, but wrestling his dead weight into the tub hadn't been easy. Nadia dampened a cloth in the washtub and pressed it to the hot skin on the back of her neck, catching her breath. No, Isaac hadn't taken the news of the engagement well at all. His ire was exhausting. The whole affair made her want to power down. Blood was spattered across the embroidery on her bodice, and the lace trim on the bottom flounce of her full skirt was saturated. She hadn't anticipated all the blood. Isaac's head, as she had discovered, had a lot of blood inside of it. He'd never told her. How was she to know these things if he never told her? Whispered cracks and crinkles sounded from the washtub as the ice within settled under Isaac's weight. Nadia dabbed at her décolletage with the damp cloth and peered in at him. He was very pale, but he was still breathing. Probably he'd be fine. Probably he just needed to power down for a while, needed to lower his core temperatures. Nadia stood and looked down at her gown. It was effectively ruined. Oh well. She grasped the front of her bodice and, with a slight grunt of effort, tore the entire thing down the middle. Tiny glass beads rained around her as she ripped the silk and lace and taffeta and horsehair crinoline in two. She dropped the swishing layers of yellow fabric, letting them pool around her feet. As she stepped out of the now doubly ruined dress, she wondered, why on earth had Isaac taken her good news so poorly? Since her debut, all she'd ever heard anyone talk about was marriage. Letitia Monroe and Prudence Cawthorne had gone on and on about the importance of finding a good man before the end of the season. Nadia had thought Isaac would be pleased at her success. Instead, he'd been so furious that he'd malfunctioned. She glanced over her shoulder at the mess that was her washroom. Half-melted ice scattered across the tiles, diluting the pooling blood and turning it pink. Yet more crimson stains upon the walls, and beads scattered hither and yon. And of course the heavy wooden frame of the shattered antique mirror, with moist, reddened tufts of gray hair stuck to the side. How frightful. But she put it out of her mind. This would be quite a chore for the maids to clean up, but they would be up to the task. They were quite good at their jobs. Nadia closed the door to her washroom and pulled the bell cord in her bedroom. She'd need to dress again, before she could go back down to dinner. Downstairs in the dining room. Isaac hadn't taken the news of Nadia's engagement well. Stephen Vanderbilt, yes, of the Boston Vanderbilts, and yes, the same Stephen Vanderbilt who was involved in that messy business with Tussie Hedron at the boat race the previous fall, reflected on Nadia's father's ire as he toyed with an oyster fork. The empty oyster shells sat before him, piled on a tray of ice. His stomach was rebelling, although he wasn't sure if it was from the oysters or the argument. Across from him, a wine stain nestled itself cozily into the white tablecloth. Stephen watched the stain, envious. That stain was about its business. It was precisely where it wanted to be. It wasn't supposed to consider itself lucky to have found something that might stick. Stephen was a man who had just eased his way past his prime. He was given to overindulgence, credulity, and metaphor. He had overindulged in the oysters, although he didn't care for them. But that was all right. He deserved them, much as he deserved to have Nadia nestled in his home like a pearl inside of an oyster's shell. When a metaphor was unavailable, Stephen often found a simile would do. But then there was the rubbery gray meat of the oyster, necessary to make the pearl, but awful in every other regard. Stephen considered how to dispose of the meat without having to eat it. The meat, of course, was Isaac, Nadia's father, or was he her warder, or an uncle? Nobody quite seemed to know, hadn't taken the news of their engagement well at all. He'd shouted, thumped his fist on the table, spilled Nadia's wine, and stormed off. He'd acted like a bridegroom jilted at the altar, not at all like a father. And Nadia, of course, sweet, pearlescent Nadia, had run after him without a word to Stephen. It was just like her, he thought, to be so concerned about Isaac. She was such a sweet girl, so compliant and quiet and charmingly naive. Stephen liked that about her, at least, her naivete and the way that she hung on his every word, like a pearl hanging onto the inside of an oyster. It had been nearly 30 minutes since she'd left, and Stephen had drunk all the wine, including what was left in Isaac's glass, and he'd eaten all the oysters, grudgingly. And now he was a little drunk and a little nauseated, and his metaphors were wandering all over the place. Like oysters probably would, if they had legs. Stephen realized he didn't know the way to the smoking parlor, so he rang for a butler. He'd need to clear his head before Nadia and Isaac came back downstairs. Inside Ada's brain. It was Ada who answered Miss Nadia's bell. Ada shouldn't have been answering Miss Nadia's bell. Ada wasn't a lady's maid. She was a kitchen girl, and had been one long enough to know the difference. But Miss Nadia's usual lady's maid, Beatrice, was sick with food poisoning, or, if the whispers in the kitchen had it right, with the early end of a secret pregnancy. And so when Miss Nadia's bell rang, Beatrice wasn't there to answer it. That still didn't mean Ada should have been the one answering Miss Nadia's bell. She should have found Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper, and said Miss Nadia's rung, and then never thought of it again. But Ada saw the bell ring, and the chime sounded like opportunity. If she answered it and did a good job, maybe she could move up someday. Maybe she could become a lady's maid herself and get herself a little more pay besides. With a pay raise, she could buy a length of purple ribbon and start tying her hair back with it. And then Albert the chauffeur would notice her long, slender neck, and he would compliment her, and she would laugh and blush, and he would take her hand and ask her if she'd meet him out in the garden later in the evening, and she would say yes. So Ada went to Miss Nadia's bedroom when the bell rang. She knew that she shouldn't have gone, she knew better than to go, but she went anyway. To her credit, she did not scream. Not right away. Here are things that Ada wanted to scream about: the bloody footprints leading from the washroom to Miss Nadia's dressing table, Miss Nadia's nudity, Miss Nadia's torso, which was hanging open like a cupboard door, the green and silver web of circuitry that filigreed the insides of Miss Nadia's ribcage, the long, ropey cable which extended from the wall to the crackling copper coil that was nested in the center of a nest of wires where Miss Nadia's heart should have been. Ada did not scream about any of these things, no, although she would have been well within her rights to do so. She did not scream because she thought a lady's maid would not scream. Instead, she clenched her fists and she asked Miss Nadia what she needed. What Miss Nadia needed was to be dressed for dinner. So without screaming, Ada dressed her. She closed Miss Nadia's ribs up, and with minimal instruction, she caulked over the seams in Miss Nadia's flesh with a tube of something that smelled foul but dried clear. She cinched Miss Nadia's corset as tightly as she could and helped Miss Nadia into her green damask dress, which was a bit heavy for spring, but which made her milk-pale skin seem to glow in the candlelight. She brushed Miss Nadia's hair and pinned it up into a cascade of curls. She wound up the long, ropey cable and tucked it away under Miss Nadia's vanity. And then, after Miss Nadia went back down to dinner, Ada walked into the washroom and saw all the blood, and that was when Ada finally screamed. Thank you for listening to Part 1 of The Lady's Maid by Sarah Gailey. Stay tuned for Part 2 coming soon as we continue this intriguing journey. In the meantime, please like, share, and subscribe to Voice Voyages. Your support is highly appreciated.